Edit, the CEO demanded. Who closed the $50 million deal? The answer left him speechless. Who really closed the $50 million deal? And why would the answer leave someone completely speechless? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here for another story filled with quiet strength, unexpected truth, and unforgettable moments. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. Thank you for watching, for being part of this community, and for encouraging us every step of the way. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you were in that room, who do you think truly deserved the credit for closing the deal? Now, let's step into the moment when one simple question changed everything. Who closed the $50 million deal? The question cut through the executive boardroom with the force of absolute authority, and in the heartbeat that followed, even the quiet hum of the ceiling vents seemed to disappear. Every polished conference chair remained perfectly still. Every laptop stayed open. Every confident smile faded just enough to betray uncertainty. No one rushed to answer. No one even dared to meet the CEO's eyes for more than a second. Nathan Whitmore stood at the head of the 20-foot walnut conference table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. At 56, he had built Whitmore Strategic Solutions from a struggling regional consulting firm into one of America's fastest-growing corporate advisory companies. He wasn't known for raising his voice. He never needed to. His calm was far more intimidating than anger could ever be. Just 30 minutes earlier, the company had finalized a landmark $50 million partnership with one of the nation's largest manufacturing groups, a deal investors had been watching for months. Champagne bottles waited unopened on a silver cart outside the conference room. The communications department had already drafted a press release celebrating the company's biggest victory in nearly a decade. Yet Nathan showed no excitement. Instead, his blue eyes slowly swept across the faces surrounding the table as though searching for something money could never buy: the truth. Ethan Brooks, executive vice president of sales, adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and forced a confident smile. Normally, he thrived in moments like these. Recognition had always found him first. Promotions followed. Headlines followed. Applause followed. Today should have been no different. He cleared his throat ever so slightly, preparing himself for the praise everyone expected was coming. But before he could speak, Nathan repeated the question, slower this time. Who closed the $50 million deal? The words hung in the air like a weight no one wanted to carry. Across the room, several department heads exchanged quick glances before looking back down at their notebooks. The legal director quietly folded her hands together. The chief financial officer removed his glasses and cleaned lenses that were already spotless. Even the newest assistants sensed something unusual unfolding. This wasn't a celebration anymore. It was an investigation. Nathan reached toward the large presentation screen mounted against the wall, where the final contract remained displayed beside a bold headline reading closed. $50 million represented years of opportunity, thousands of jobs, and the future direction of the company. Nathan knew every negotiation had a face behind it. Every breakthrough had a voice. Every impossible agreement had someone willing to keep working long after everyone else believed it couldn't be done. Yet something about this victory refused to fit the story now forming around the room. Ethan's smile tightened almost invisibly. He had rehearsed dozens of acceptance speeches throughout his career, but suddenly none of them felt appropriate. Across the far end of the conference room, almost hidden behind a row of senior managers, sat a man very few executives noticed unless they needed another report revised before sunrise. Daniel Carter quietly closed his laptop without saying a single word. His tie was slightly loosened after another late night. A framed photograph of his young daughter rested inside his worn leather briefcase, tucked beside a lunch container he hadn't even opened yet. While the room waited for someone important to speak, Daniel simply gathered his notes with the practiced calm of a man who had long ago learned that the loudest voices rarely carried the greatest truths. And somehow, without anyone realizing it yet, the answer to Nathan Whitmore's question had been sitting silently in that room all along. 3 weeks earlier, before the contract became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about, Daniel Carter had been exactly where most people expected to find him, arriving at the office while the city outside was still wrapped in the pale blue light before sunrise. He parked his 12-year-old pickup truck in the far corner of the employee lot, not because he had to, but because he liked leaving the closer spaces for employees rushing in later with children or heavy equipment. He carried a plain black laptop bag over one shoulder and a reusable lunch container in the other hand, greeting the security guard with the same warm smile every single morning. "Morning, Frank." "Morning, Daniel." Early again, Daniel simply smiled. Deadlines never sleep. By 7 o'clock, he was already reviewing market reports while most of the sales floor remained dark and silent. His desk sat near the back corner of the open office, away from the executive suites lined with glass walls and polished wood. It was not the kind of desk visitors noticed during company tours. There were no awards displayed, no expensive decorations, only a family photograph showing Daniel beside his 11-year-old daughter, Lily, standing on a beach during their annual weekend trip to the Oregon coast. The picture reminded him every day why he worked as hard as he did. Since losing his wife years earlier to a sudden illness, every decision had revolved around giving Lily stability, honesty, and the confidence that quiet people could still build meaningful lives. Daniel rarely stayed for office gossip. He skipped politics, ignored competition, and never interrupted anyone during meetings. Some colleagues appreciated him. Many barely noticed him. Others assumed he simply lacked ambition, because he never promoted himself. What they failed to see was that nearly every important proposal crossing the executive floor had quietly passed through Daniel's computer first. Numbers that did not balance somehow balanced after he reviewed them. Risk analyses became clearer. Presentations became sharper. Client concerns disappeared before anyone else even recognized they existed. He never asked for applause because solving problems had become a habit rather than a performance. Late that same afternoon, the sales department gathered inside the strategy room to discuss a promising manufacturing client expected to generate tens of millions in future revenue. Excitement filled the room as managers offered aggressive forecasts and polished talking points. Ethan Brooks stood confidently near the digital display, speaking with the effortless charisma that had earned admiration across the company. Every sentence sounded convincing. Every prediction sounded certain. Nathan Whitmore listened quietly from the end of the table without revealing much expression. Daniel remained seated along the side wall, writing notes instead of speaking. He noticed several assumptions that did not match the client's financial filings. He recognized overlooked supply chain risks hidden inside public records. He even identified cultural details that could influence the negotiation because he had spent the previous weekend researching the client's leadership team, while Lily completed homework beside him at their small kitchen table. When the discussion paused, Daniel raised his hand politely. The room barely noticed. Ethan glanced toward him with a courteous smile that carried just enough impatience to end the interruption before it truly began. "If you have something," Ethan said, "just send it over afterward. We are running short on time." Daniel nodded without argument. "Of course." He closed his notebook, returned to his desk, and quietly prepared another detailed report, unaware that the pages he was about to write would eventually become the invisible foundation beneath the most important agreement the company had ever celebrated. The following morning, Daniel arrived to find an invitation waiting in his inbox. The subject line read, "Executive Review Meeting." He assumed someone had finally noticed the concerns he had documented the night before. Carrying his notebook into the conference room, he quietly took a seat near the wall as department leaders settled into their usual places. Nathan Whitmore opened the meeting with a brief summary of the opportunity ahead, then invited fresh ideas before the client presentation scheduled for the following week. Daniel listened carefully as forecasts filled the room. Growth projections appeared optimistic. Revenue models looked polished. Yet the deeper conversation drifted farther away from what the client had actually requested. After several minutes, Daniel respectfully raised his hand. Nathan nodded. "Go ahead, Daniel." Every eye turned toward him. He stood calmly and opened his notebook. "I believe the client is not looking for the lowest price," he said evenly. "They are looking for the lowest long-term operational risk. If we continue positioning ourselves around cost alone, another firm can undercut us within 6 months." A few people exchanged skeptical looks. Daniel continued without changing his tone. Their annual reports consistently emphasize supplier stability, leadership continuity, and implementation support. If we redesign our proposal around those priorities instead of discounts, we become much harder to replace. Silence followed for a brief moment before Ethan Brooks smiled politely. Interesting perspective, he said, but I think we should avoid overcomplicating a straightforward sales strategy. Several managers nodded in agreement. Nathan simply replied, "Thank you, Daniel. Please send your analysis to the executive team after the meeting." Daniel sat down without disappointment. He had never expected applause. That afternoon, he spent nearly 4 hours refining every detail. He reorganized financial models, rewrote the proposal structure, added implementation milestones, and even anticipated objections the client might raise during negotiations. Before leaving the office, he emailed the complete document to the executive leadership group, attaching supporting research and clearly labeling it as a draft for discussion. He shut down his computer, picked up Lily from her after-school science club, and spent the evening helping her build a model solar system across their kitchen table. Work disappeared from his mind the moment she laughed after accidentally painting one of the foam planets bright green instead of blue. The next morning, however, something unexpected happened. During the company's strategy rehearsal, Ethan confidently walked to the front of the room carrying a presentation no one else had seen. Slide after slide echoed the exact framework Daniel had developed. The revised pricing philosophy, the implementation roadmap, the client-specific concerns. Even several phrases Daniel had carefully written appeared almost word for word. Around the table, executives complimented Ethan's preparation. Excellent insight. Very strategic. Exactly what this client needs. Daniel quietly looked down at his notebook. He recognized every chart because he had created them. He recognized every recommendation because he had spent hours verifying each number. Yet he said nothing. Nathan watched the presentation with thoughtful interest, unaware of its true origin. When the rehearsal ended, Ethan accepted congratulations with practiced confidence, while Daniel simply returned to his desk. Frank, the security guard, happened to pass by the office windows during his afternoon rounds and noticed Daniel still working long after most of the meeting had ended. "Big project?" Frank asked with a friendly smile. Daniel looked up and returned the same calm expression he always carried. "Just making sure everything works," he replied. He never added another word, because somewhere deep inside, he still believed that the work itself would eventually speak louder than the person receiving the credit. By the beginning of the following week, confidence had spread through Whitmore's strategic solutions like sunlight pouring through the glass walls of its downtown headquarters. The presentation had impressed the client during the first round of discussions, and executives were already talking as though the agreement was practically finished. Coffee stations buzzed with optimistic conversations. Marketing teams drafted promotional materials. Finance began forecasting next year's revenue growth. Yet Daniel Carter noticed details that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Late one afternoon, while reviewing the latest email exchange, he saw the client's legal department introduce a completely revised list of requirements. The changes were not minor. The proposed implementation schedule had been shortened dramatically. New performance guarantees had been added. Long-term service expectations had expanded well beyond the original proposal. Daniel quietly compared every revision against the company's current capabilities. The numbers no longer aligned. If handled carelessly, months of work could disappear with a single misunderstanding. He immediately prepared a detailed assessment and forwarded it to Ethan Brooks along with several recommendations. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan appeared beside Daniel's desk. His expression remained composed, but there was tension behind his smile. "I saw your email," Ethan said. "The client is simply negotiating. That is normal." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Some of it is normal, but several of these requests change the entire structure of the agreement. We should address them before tomorrow's call." Ethan folded his arms. "Leave the negotiation to leadership. We do not want to create unnecessary concern." Without another word, he walked away carrying a printed copy of Daniel's analysis. The following morning, the executive negotiation began through a secure video conference. Department heads gathered inside the largest conference room, while analysts watched quietly from adjacent offices. Daniel remained at his workstation, monitoring financial models in case updated calculations became necessary. For the first 30 minutes, everything appeared smooth. Then the atmosphere shifted. Through internal messages appearing on the company's collaboration system, Daniel could tell the discussion had become increasingly difficult. The client questioned implementation timelines. They challenged projected cost savings. They requested operational guarantees beyond what Ethan had anticipated. One executive message after another appeared asking for revised calculations. Another requested risk projections. Another requested alternative pricing scenarios. Daniel responded immediately each time, sending carefully prepared spreadsheets and supporting documentation within minutes. Inside the conference room, Ethan presented each solution with growing confidence, but every answer had originated from Daniel's keyboard only moments earlier. Nearly 2 hours into the meeting, an unexpected message arrived directly from the client's chief operating officer. They wanted immediate clarification regarding a highly technical integration issue that no one had discussed before. Silence followed. Daniel waited. Minutes passed without a response from leadership. Finally, his office phone rang. It was the executive assistant speaking softly. "Daniel, Mr. Brooks would like you to join the support room." He carried his laptop upstairs without hesitation. Behind the main conference room sat a smaller operations center where additional staff quietly assisted negotiations without appearing on camera. Ethan looked exhausted as Daniel entered. Several executives stared at complex data spread across multiple monitors. Ethan turned toward him. "Can you prepare something that addresses this integration concern?" Daniel looked over the documents for less than a minute before calmly replying, "I already did. It is in the appendix of the report I sent yesterday." The room became unusually quiet. One analyst quickly opened Daniel's original file. There it was, every concern anticipated, every calculation completed, every possible solution carefully organized days before the client had ever asked the question. For the first time since negotiations began, no one spoke. They simply looked at Daniel, and then back at the screen, realizing that the most important answers had been sitting quietly in front of them long before anyone thought to ask. The operations center moved with quiet urgency as the negotiation entered its most delicate stage. Computer monitors displayed financial projections, implementation timelines, and legal revisions that seemed to multiply by the minute. Every executive understood that one careless answer could erase months of preparation. Daniel Carter remained standing beside the analysts, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, studying each new request with the same steady concentration he had shown since the project began. He never raised his voice. He never competed for attention. Instead, he opened another spreadsheet, reviewed the client's latest comments, and calmly adjusted several assumptions that everyone else had overlooked. Within minutes, he prepared a revised operational model that balanced the client's expectations with the company's actual capacity. An analyst looked at the numbers and whispered, "This actually works." Daniel simply nodded. "Send it to the conference room." Ethan Brooks accepted the updated material without acknowledging where it had come from. Moments later, he confidently presented the revised solution to the client as though it had been part of the original strategy. The discussion immediately became more productive. Questions that had seemed impossible only minutes earlier now received clear, practical answers supported by precise data. The client's leadership team leaned forward with growing interest instead of skepticism. Their chief financial officer requested additional projections covering the next 5 years. Daniel quietly prepared them before anyone had to ask twice. Their operations director wanted implementation milestones measured by realistic production targets. Daniel had already anticipated that request as well. One by one, every obstacle seemed to lose its weight, not because luck had appeared, but because someone had spent countless unseen hours preparing for problems long before they arrived. Nearly 2 hours later, the lead negotiator from the client smiled for the first time that afternoon. "We appreciate the level of preparation your company has demonstrated," he said. "Your solutions reflect an understanding of our business that goes far beyond a traditional sales presentation." Around the conference room, shoulders slowly relaxed. Nathan Whitmore remained composed, but he noticed something curious. Nearly every strong response Ethan offered arrived only after another document quietly appeared from the adjacent support room. Nathan said nothing. He simply observed. Then came the final question, the one everyone had feared. The client asked whether Whitmore's strategic solutions would commit to a long-term performance review process extending well beyond the initial agreement. It required confidence, flexibility, and a detailed framework that had never been discussed publicly. Ethan hesitated for the first time all day. The room fell silent. Before uncertainty could grow, another document appeared on his screen. Daniel had already built a complete review schedule weeks earlier, complete with measurable benchmarks, quarterly evaluations, and realistic adjustment procedures. Ethan read through it carefully before presenting the proposal. The client's executives exchanged approving smiles. Their chief executive officer leaned toward the camera. "That is exactly the partnership model we hoped to find." Less than 15 minutes later, digital signatures began appearing across the agreement. $50 million. Years of opportunity. Hundreds of future projects. The largest contract in company history had officially become reality. Applause erupted throughout the executive conference room. Staff members outside began congratulating one another. The unopened champagne bottles were finally carried inside. Ethan accepted handshakes from every direction while cameras captured the celebration for internal communications. Meanwhile, in the smaller support room, Daniel quietly saved the final project files, closed his laptop, and checked the time. Lily's school day would end in less than 45 minutes. He placed the family photograph back inside his briefcase, wished the analysts a pleasant evening, and slipped out through a side hallway without interrupting the celebration. Behind him, the building echoed with excitement. Ahead of him waited a little girl who only cared whether her father would arrive in time to hear about her science presentation, and to Daniel, that remained the most important appointment of the entire day. The celebration lasted well into the evening, but Nathan Whitmore found himself thinking less about the signed contract and more about the unusual rhythm of the negotiation that had produced it. Long after most employees had gone home, he remained alone in his office overlooking the city skyline, the framed copy of the newly executed agreement resting on his desk beside an untouched glass of sparkling water. Success usually brought clarity. Tonight, it brought questions. Nathan opened the digital project archive, intending to review several final documents before the board meeting scheduled for the next morning. At first, everything appeared exactly as expected. Presentation files carried Ethan Brooks's name. Executive summaries listed senior leadership. Meeting schedules reflected weeks of careful planning. Yet as Nathan clicked deeper into the revision history, a different pattern quietly emerged. Nearly every major document contained dozens of tracked edits made by the same employee. Daniel Carter. Nathan paused. He opened another file. Again, Daniel's name appeared throughout the revision log. Pricing adjustments. Risk analysis. Contract language suggestions. Operational benchmarks. Nathan frowned slightly and opened a third document. The result was identical. Every significant improvement had originated from Daniel's workstation days before the executive presentations were delivered. Curious now, Nathan searched the company's internal communication records related to the project. Hundreds of emails appeared. He began reading carefully. Daniel had consistently identified potential obstacles before anyone else mentioned them. He had prepared contingency plans without being asked. He had responded to urgent requests within minutes, often late at night or before sunrise. More surprisingly, many of the ideas later presented during executive meetings had first arrived as detailed reports sent quietly from Daniel's inbox to leadership. Nathan leaned back in his chair, saying nothing. The silence inside his office felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a successful day. It was the silence that comes when overlooked details begin fitting together into an entirely different picture. He opened the company's document, management system, and examined the metadata attached to the proposal that ultimately secured the agreement. Original author, Daniel Carter. Initial framework, Daniel Carter. Risk appendix, Daniel Carter. Integration model, Daniel Carter. Quarterly review process, Daniel Carter. Even the final revisions completed during the negotiation traced directly back to files Daniel had created before the client requested them. Nathan slowly removed his reading glasses and rested them on the desk. He was not a man who enjoyed making assumptions, especially about people. Over 4 decades in business had taught him that appearances often rewarded confidence, while quietly hiding competence somewhere else entirely. He pressed the intercom button connecting his office to the executive assistant, who was still finishing paperwork outside. "Emily," he said calmly, "would you send me the attendance records from every strategy meeting related to the manufacturing project?" Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Minutes later, the reports arrived. Daniel had attended nearly every planning session. His name appeared consistently near the bottom of participant lists. Ethan had spoken during almost all of them. Daniel had rarely spoken at all. Nathan studied the documents for several more minutes before noticing one final detail that caused him to stop completely. The client's chief operating officer had sent a private message immediately after the agreement was signed. Nathan had overlooked it during the celebration. He opened it now. The message was brief, professional, and unmistakably sincere. It thanked Whitmore Strategic Solutions for assigning someone with such exceptional technical understanding to the project and expressed appreciation for the thoughtful preparation reflected throughout every stage of the negotiation. Yet the message did not mention Ethan Brooks. It specifically praised Daniel Carter by name. Nathan read the sentence twice before quietly standing and walking toward the dark window overlooking the city. Somewhere below, employees had already returned to their ordinary lives. But inside that silent office, one small message had just transformed the biggest victory in company history into a question that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, an unexpected calendar invitation appeared in the inbox of every executive involved in the manufacturing account. Mandatory leadership review. Attendance required. No agenda. No explanation. By 9 o'clock, the executive boardroom had filled once again with polished suits, open laptops, and carefully rehearsed confidence. Ethan Brooks entered with the relaxed smile of a man still enjoying the success of the company's largest agreement. Several colleagues congratulated him as he took his usual seat near the front of the table. Daniel Carter almost missed the meeting entirely. He had been reviewing implementation schedules when Emily, the executive assistant, quietly approached his desk. "Mr. Whitmore would like you in the boardroom as well." Daniel looked surprised. "Are you certain?" Emily smiled politely. "He specifically asked for you." A few minutes later, Daniel entered the room carrying only his notebook. Instead of sitting near the executives, he chose an empty chair along the side wall, just as he always had. Nathan Whitmore waited until every seat was filled before closing the conference room door himself. His expression remained calm, but there was a seriousness that immediately silenced every quiet conversation. Without opening the presentation prepared for the board meeting, Nathan connected his laptop to the large display and projected a single timeline across the screen. It showed the entire history of the manufacturing project from the first client inquiry to the signed agreement. "Before we discuss implementation," Nathan began evenly, "I would like to better understand how this partnership became successful." Ethan smiled. "Of course." Nathan looked toward him. "Excellent. Then perhaps you can help us." He clicked to the next slide. A document appeared with detailed revision history highlighted in different colors. Every significant strategic change carried the same author identification. Daniel Carter. Nathan said nothing for several seconds. The silence itself became part of the conversation. Finally, he asked, "Can someone explain why every major revision originated from one employee while the presentations reflected someone else's work?" Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Ethan cleared his throat. Daniel supported the project, as many people did. Nathan nodded slightly without disagreement. Then he opened another document. More revision histories appeared. Then another. Then another. Pricing strategy. Risk assessment. Integration planning. Client response preparation. Long-term implementation framework. Every file pointed toward the same source. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the notebook resting quietly in his hands. He had never expected any of this to become public. Nathan continued speaking with remarkable composure. "Support is valuable," he said. "But support and authorship are not always the same thing." The room remained perfectly still. Nathan then selected one final email from the project archive and displayed it on the screen. It contained Daniel's original recommendations sent days before the negotiation reached its most difficult stage. Every challenge the client eventually presented had already been anticipated. Every proposed solution had already been outlined. The timestamps left little room for interpretation. Nathan slowly turned toward Ethan. "Did you receive this report before the negotiation?" Ethan hesitated. "Yes." "Did you review it?" "Yes." "Did these recommendations become part of our presentation?" Ethan looked around the room before answering quietly. "Yes." Nathan folded his hands together. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment shaped by undeniable facts. He glanced toward Daniel, who still had not spoken a single word. "Mr. Carter," Nathan asked gently, "when you prepared these materials, what recognition were you expecting?" Daniel looked up with the same calm expression he had carried throughout every challenge of the project. He thought for only a moment before answering. "I was hoping the client would receive the best solution we could provide." No one interrupted. No one looked away. In that simple reply, every polished speech about leadership suddenly sounded much smaller, and for the first time, the room began to understand that. Genuine character often worked quietly long before anyone thought to applaud it. The room remained silent long after Daniel finished speaking. His answer was so simple that it left no space for argument. Nathan Whitmore slowly looked around the conference table, meeting the eyes of every executive before turning back toward the large display. "There is one final piece of this story," he said calmly. He pressed a key on his laptop, and the conference room screen switched to a live video connection. A familiar face appeared almost immediately. It was Margaret Ellis, the chief operating officer of the manufacturing company that had signed the historic agreement. Several executives straightened in their chairs, surprised that she had joined the meeting without prior notice. Nathan greeted her warmly. "Margaret, thank you for taking a few minutes to speak with us." She smiled. "It is my pleasure, Nathan." Nathan continued in his usual measured tone. "Our leadership team is reviewing the project, and I would appreciate your perspective. From your company's point of view, what ultimately convinced you to move forward with our proposal?" Margaret did not hesitate. "The preparation." She smiled again before continuing. "Every time we introduced a new concern, your team already had a thoughtful response. It felt less like a sales presentation and more like someone genuinely understood the challenges we face every day." Several executives nodded proudly until Margaret added her next sentence. "I especially appreciated the conversations I had with Mr. Daniel Carter." Every head in the room turned toward Daniel. He looked genuinely surprised. Margaret continued speaking with quiet sincerity. "During the technical working sessions, he never tried to impress us. He listened first. Then he asked questions that no other consulting firm had asked. His recommendations acknowledged risks instead of pretending they did not exist. That honesty built trust before pricing was ever discussed." Nathan glanced toward Ethan, but said nothing. Margaret smiled as she remembered another detail. "There was one evening when our implementation team stayed online much later than expected. Most people were ready to postpone the discussion until the next week. Mr. Carter remained patient the entire time. He reorganized the framework, answered every operational concern, and even suggested several improvements that benefited both organizations. After that meeting, our executive committee unanimously agreed that your company was the right partner." Nathan leaned forward slightly. "Just to clarify, was Mr. Brooks leading that discussion?" Margaret politely shook her head. "No. Mr. Brooks joined several executive meetings and represented your company professionally. But the technical confidence that allowed us to approve the agreement came from Mr. Carter. Our board specifically referenced his preparation during the final approval vote." The conference room became so quiet that the gentle sound of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. No one interrupted. No one challenged her statement. There was nothing left to question because the truth had arrived from the people whose decision mattered most. Nathan thanked Margaret for her time, and the video call ended. The screen faded to black, reflecting the faces around the table like a mirror asking each person to examine themselves. Nathan slowly stood and walked toward Daniel. He did not hurry. He did not speak immediately. Finally, he stopped beside the quiet analyst who had spent weeks working without recognition. "Mr. Carter," Nathan said with unmistakable respect, "thank you for serving this company with a level of integrity that every leader in this room should learn from." Daniel rose from his chair, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "I was only doing my job," he answered softly. Nathan smiled for the first time that morning. "No, Daniel. You were doing something much greater than that. You were protecting the reputation of this company even when no one was protecting yours." Around the table, executives lowered their eyes, not because anyone had humiliated them, but because quiet truth had accomplished what loud words never could. No one applauded as the meeting came to an end. Somehow, applause would have felt too small for what had just happened. The executives quietly gathered their notebooks and laptops, leaving the boardroom with thoughtful expressions instead of confident smiles. Ethan Brooks remained seated for several moments, staring at the conference table where so many victories had once seemed certain. Nathan Whitmore did not criticize him in front of the others. He simply believed that truth carried enough weight on its own. Before leaving the room, Nathan turned toward Daniel Carter one final time. "Would you join me in my office?" Daniel nodded. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other as morning sunlight filled the quiet office overlooking the city. Nathan opened a folder that contained a formal promotion, a substantial salary increase, and an invitation to become Director of Strategic Solutions, leading the very team whose work he had quietly strengthened for years. Nathan slid the documents across the desk, but did not rush Daniel to answer. "You earned this long before today," he said. Daniel looked at the papers for a moment before lifting his eyes. "I appreciate your confidence, Nathan." He paused thoughtfully. "If I accept, I would like to ask for one thing." Nathan smiled slightly. "Go ahead. Build a culture where ideas are recognized because they are true, not because they come from the loudest voice in the room." Nathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stood, extended his hand, and shook Daniel's with genuine respect. "That begins today." Over the following weeks, subtle changes spread throughout Whitmore Strategic Solutions. Project files included clear authorship records. Team meetings encouraged quieter employees to share their perspectives before final decisions were made. Managers were evaluated not only by results, but also by how honestly they developed and recognized the people around them. The company grew stronger, not because new policies appeared overnight, but because integrity had become visible. Daniel settled into his new responsibilities with the same humility that had defined every ordinary morning before anyone knew his name. He still arrived early. He still greeted Frank at the front entrance. He still carried the same worn leather briefcase with Lily's photograph tucked safely inside. Titles had changed, but character had not. One Friday afternoon, Daniel left the office exactly on time and drove to Lily's middle school for the annual science showcase. She spotted him the moment he entered the gymnasium and waved with the bright excitement only a child can give. "Dad, you made it." Daniel smiled warmly. "I would not miss it for anything." She proudly showed him the first-place ribbon attached to her environmental engineering project. "My teacher said the best designs solve problems without making people feel small," she said. Daniel looked at her for a quiet moment before smiling even wider. "That sounds like a lesson worth remembering." As they walked toward the parking lot beneath the soft glow of the evening sky, Lily slipped her hand into his. Downtown skyscrapers shimmered in the distance, including the office where recognition had finally found the man who had never chased it. Daniel did not think about promotions, headlines, or executive meetings. He thought about gratitude, second chances, and the quiet dignity that had carried him through every unnoticed hour. Sometimes the world celebrates the loudest voice first, but sooner or later, truth has a way of finding its own audience. And when it finally does, respect is not demanded, it is quietly earned.